Good evening. It is Monday, July 10th at 5:30, and I'm calling the Economic Development Authority meeting to order. I'm looking for a motion to adopt this evening's agenda.
I'll make that motion.
Moved by Fay, second by Henrik. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. First item of business this evening is to approve the minutes from May 15th, 2023 EDA special meeting and June 16th, 2023 EDA special meeting.
I'll make that motion.
Motion by Burek,
Second.
second by Francis. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of approving the two sets of minutes signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Motion carries 6-0. Our new business this evening is a presentation from Tammy Omdal with Northland Public Finance, and she's going to talk to us about tax increment financing and tax abatement. So welcome to the podium, and thank you for being here tonight.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I almost said mayor and council, members of the EDA. Tammy Omdal with Northland Public Finance. We were trying to figure out, a few of us, I think maybe in 2018, I thought during COVID that I was before the EDA. And during that time, it was specific to the redevelopment project. Tonight, I'm going to speak in more general terms about tax increment financing and actually tax abatement. So let me get started. I understand you have in your packet a copy of the presentation. It's about 50 slides. Some of those include the headers. I could get through this in 20 or 30 minutes. The reason I say that is depends on your questions. If you have questions, we'll spend time on those questions and a specific topic that I'm covering, and I can adjust as we go through. And if there's not a lot of questions, I will just thoughtfully go through the slides so that you can have some new information. Does that sound like a plan? Okay. So as I mentioned, this is not specific to a tax increment request or tax abatement. This is to provide general information to the EDA to help inform future decisions that you may have related to specific projects. I am going to focus on two areas. I'm going to focus on TIF and tax abatement. For the TIF, I'm going to focus on source and use of TIF. And when I say TIF, I mean tax increment financing, and I am not going to assume anyone knows what that means. I'm going to explain that in a moment. I'm going to talk about development agreements. When I'm talking about development agreements in this context, I'm talking about agreements to provide TIF or tax abatement assistance. I know the city does development agreements related to land use. That's not what I mean when I say development agreement this evening. Managing TIF districts, I'll go really quick through that part, but that's important too because that's the things that often happen behind the scenes, and you might say, well, why does the EDA care? I'll tell you why you would care about that. And then last, I had talked to Mark in preparing for this. I thought I would just quickly touch on tax abatement. Tax abatement is really TIF light in this context, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So TIF, tax increment financing, is simply a method to capture the increase in value from new development. So you can never capture the value on bare land. It's always what comes on top of that. The reason it's called tax increment is because that new development, oftentimes it's a new building, but sometimes it's redevelopment of an existing building. It's the increases in property taxes, hi Mark, resulting from the increase in the taxable market value from development. TIF exists in, I believe, all 50 states in one form or another. Minnesota is highly restrictive with its use of TIF. If we were in Iowa or Wisconsin, cities, authorities have a lot of authority, small a, in the use and capturing of taxes. That is not true in Minnesota. It is very prescribed, which is why I'm here tonight to just shed a little light on what that means to be prescriptive in state law. Property taxes from the increase in valuation are used to finance or reimburse TIF-eligible project costs. TIF occurs over time. Under Minnesota law, you build a new building, it's 2 years before that increase in taxes hit that you start paying on it. That's why that term reimbursement, because if you're planning to use tax increment to assist a project, either the developer has to finance those costs up front and be reimbursed with TIF, or there are still some examples in Minnesota, not that many, that cities issue tax increment financing bonds, general obligation, full faith and credit bonds, where the city or the authority, I should say city, because authorities can't issue, cities issue the bonds where they use the future tax increment to pay back those general obligation bonds. After the captured property taxes for TIF ends, then everyone, all the taxing jurisdictions enjoy the increase in that tax base. And I'm going to talk about how long that takes to get there. TIF is while it's prescriptive in Minnesota, it is still a very powerful tool. I'll probably cover this in a slide coming up, but what I mean by that is the city and the authority can't act alone. The city has to hold the hearing and ratify. So I'll use city, small c, has the ability to capture those local property taxes with no veto power by the school district, the county, or the special taxing jurisdictions. That's why it's a very powerful tool. It's I keep using that word prescriptive, meaning there's a lot of things you got to check off and do as far as the process, but it's a very powerful tool because nobody can veto it provided you follow what's prescribed in law. I said I was going to talk about the source and use of TIF revenue. Let's do that next. So the source of the TIF revenue comes from those property taxes that we were talking about. The county, a property tax statement, they pay their bill, a property taxpayer pays their bill, county collects the taxes, and they distribute tax increment to authority like they distribute general property taxes to a city, county, or school district. It's just that it needs to go in a separate bucket once it is received by an authority or a city. EDAs can establish TIF districts. City councils can also establish without an EDA involvement. That is true for cities that have EDA and true, of course, for cities that don't. The reason some cities go through their EDA is because there's a reason that you exist and a city establishes an EDA, and oftentimes cities want to have their EDAs administer those TIF districts. The approval always falls with the city council, though. Captured property taxes attributed to that increase from value from new development are used to support the development. That whole but for, because this tool is so powerful, meaning capturing other taxing jurisdictions' taxes, you have to be in a position, and oftentimes you rely on consultants like myself and your staff to give you information to make an informed decision so that when you establish a TIF district and pass a resolution, that you are able to make in that but-for finding that is in state law, meaning you're making the finding that but for the capturing of that tax increment revenue, that the project as proposed would not go forward. Doesn't mean nothing would happen on a site. It means that project would not occur in a reasonable time frame. And I often say that because oftentimes consultants like myself, when we're before EDAs and cities, well, do you always say yes, that there's always the need for TIF? Oftentimes that's true for this reason. Most of the developers in Minnesota understand TIF law, or they have professionals that guide them to, and they understand that they cannot be asking for tax forgiveness or TIF, but for that demonstrated need that they need it in order for the project to move forward. There's a fixed term or duration to collect TIF that is generated, and I will talk about that coming up. Madam President, Mayor, as I go through, if there are questions, I welcome to be interrupted while I'm going through rather than waiting till the end. So for the members too, if you're okay with that.
I'll just ask that everyone get your attention.
Okay.
If they have one, thank you.
So here, this looks a little complicated, but TIF revenue comes, as I've said it a few times, from property taxes paid by development within a TIF district. How does that work? So there's a parcel that has taxable market value. In Minnesota, and the council and the EDA may know this, that not all property pays taxes, not all property has their value taxed the same. Excuse my voice. Commercial taxes have a different tax rate than apartments and residential. So how the TIF is determined, so the parcel's taxable market value multiplied by their class rate, depending on if they're commercial, residential, and that becomes the net tax capacity. I'm not trying to give you a math lesson here, I'm trying to get to the TIF. So you get to that net tax capacity for the district, that gets multiplied by the local tax capacity rates. And with TIF, as I noted, you get to capture not just the city, You get to capture the county, the school district, the mosquito control district, the Met Council, all of the local taxes that are spread over net tax capacity. The taxes that you cannot capture, and this is meaningful when it's a commercial development, is the state general property tax, cannot be captured by you, and the school referendum tax. So when there is new development, while the EDA and the city can determine to capture the school's net tax capacity-based property taxes, the school referendum that is spread on value goes immediately to the school district. And so that is an immediate benefit to the school district, and the same with the state and the taxes that they collect. Net capacity, tax capacity from land and existing building value is not captured. I opened my comments talking about bare land. There's never increment from bare land, the base value. If land values rise significantly while that property is within a TIF district, that increase in value from the land is captured, but not the original value. The reason the law is set up that way is because TIF is not meant to cause the county, cities, and the school district to lose tax base. It's simply saying, but for the EDA's decision to capture those taxes, that project wouldn't go forward, meaning there wouldn't be any increase in taxes. So you're not deciding to redirect taxes, you're deciding to make a project feasible in the reasonable foreseeable future that otherwise would not occur. And that goes to that last point, that net tax capacity growth above that original is what is captured by the TIF district and generates the TIF revenue. This next slide is just simply an illustration of that. In that bottom little sliver being, that's in this example of a $10.5 million total taxable market value project at completion, that $500,000 of value becomes the base value. The county auditor sets that up in their system, and you never collect taxes for increment off that base value. In this example, it's the $10 million that would generate increment that the EDA or an authority could put to use to assist a project. Not meant to go through these numbers. This is to illustrate a point. So here's an example of taxes payable in TIF. So in that first column where it says current taxes payable 23, in this example, these parcels that are in this illustrative TIF district are paying about $74,000 in taxes. With an establishment of a TIF district, upon completion, those taxes to those jurisdictions would increase from 73 to 109. You might say, well, why is that, Tammy? You said that they would stay the same. There is some change because of once the classification of property changes, so if you have land that is currently guided commercial and changes to residential for the TIF project, that impacts to some degree the amount of city, school, and county. But really the drivers here in this example is the school district going from 16,000 to 81,000. School referendum taxes cannot be captured. That's what's driving that. The other taxing jurisdictions, in this example, it's a project that's going from commercial to residential. The reason the other taxing jurisdictions in this example drop so significantly is the state property tax. Residential does not pay state property tax, so that would be a reduction. In total, this illustrative project, I'm on the far right bottom corner, almost $600,000 in real estate taxes. Of that, 487 would be captured for TIF. And you can see how much is the city, school, county. And again, I'm not focused on the numbers here in this example. It's simply to say that TIF does not impact the taxing jurisdictions from what they're currently getting, otherwise, except for when there's classification changes. It's really a decision to capture that increase in taxes to assist a project that otherwise would not move forward without the TIF.
Tammy, in the case of, for example, our downtown development, I know you weren't trying to pull that in, but since nothing's on it, it's owned by the city, and there is currently no revenue from it in the form of taxation, who is responsible for determining that base level value that begins if we choose to implement a TIF, who's responsible for creating that land value basis that everything above that is what's captured from the TIF?
Great question.
Is that an assessor?
It is.
Okay.
So even though there's not taxes paid when there's tax exempt property, the county, through the county assessor, still has a value. It's tax exempt on property. That becomes the base value. Sometimes it's a timing issue because those values are often not as current. So depending on the timing, under state law, the assessor may have to update an estimate of value for a tax exempt property. But that is often a misconception because if property's tax exempt, when an authority is looking at TIF, it assumes, well, it's zero, so we're going to generate a lot of increment. That is not how it works. That's why I had that ugly slide up a moment ago and you followed that with those boxes, because then once the use changes and becomes taxable, then the county assessor, the assigned value, even though it was exempt before, now it's taxable, times whatever the respective class rate is, depending on the use, the new use that is going to occur on that property.
Always be the case. The assessor will determine a base value. The developer has nothing to do with determining the base value, for example, on the value at which they determine they'll pay for the property.
You are correct.
Okay.
You are correct. Great question. So what impacts those TIF revenues that we've been talking about? Timing of development, so the collection of the first increment. The collection of the first increment happens after 2 years after the development is completed, because if a project was constructed in 23, it would be valued in January 24 for taxes payable in 25. So there's always that 2-year lag. The clock starts on a district, and I'll talk about the terms for different types in a moment, the first year that increment is collected. So let's just say it's an economic development district, which allows for 8 years after the first year of collection. So once that first year starts, the clock starts. One of the challenges, especially economic development districts, it doesn't matter if it's a few $100s by chance because the land value went up and they didn't get started and generate some increment. An authority or city cannot tell the county, we don't want that increment, that $200, $500. You have to accept it and the clock starts. That happens sometimes, more often with economic development districts, because you cannot, the other types you can elect the first year of collection, you cannot for an economic development. Property reclassification, we were just talking about that with your question to me on tax exempt. Now we're still talking about what impacts TIF revenue. Future market value and inflationary impacts. You do a TIF plan 2 years before a project can get started. You're estimating, sometimes depending on the complexity, we may ask the county assessor to weigh in and help us estimate that taxable market value. But the county assessor is not agreeing to what that value is going to be. It's simply given a preliminary set of plans, what might they value it at. I'm not going to cover this today, but being I brought this up, sometimes in those development agreements, and remember when I say development agreements tonight, I mean TIF agreements, you can, under negotiation, enter an agreement with the developer on a minimum assessment value, but not the ceiling. That stays open based upon the county assessor's estimate. Changes in local tax capacity rates. You might have a district, and this is true because tax rates have been declining recently because of values rising. So you established a TIF district and rates were higher, for example, during the Great Recession, and then rates start to fall. You do not get a windfall of increment based upon what rates were when you established a district. There's less increment generated. But also, for a developer, it means they're paying less in real estate taxes as well than what may have been estimated at the beginning of a TIF district. Property tax reform. For those that were around in 2001 when the state took over the general education levy, there were TIF revenue notes around the state, and some general obligation bonds that all of a sudden were short on revenue because the tax rates dropped significantly in 2001 when the state legislature made the decision to take over the general education levy. The types of districts. So here are the types. The most common types are redevelopment. Renewal and renovation is very similar to a redevelopment district, but the hurdle to establish it is not as high, and nor is the term of collecting increment. Economic development. Economic development, if I can speak tonight, economic development means manufacturing, industrial, warehouse for cities in the metro counties. When you get out into greater Minnesota, it can mean something different that I won't get into. Housing districts. Housing just doesn't mean any housing. As the EDA has had on that site discussions, housing means that it can be market rate housing, but has to have an affordable component pursuant to the TIF law. Soils condition, much less uncommon, it's not very common. And then other hazardous substance sub-districts. Those are, and more, I work with the city of Fridley, for example. We have a lot of hazardous sub-districts in Fridley, for example. Here's the terms, I've been referring to that. So the economic development, it has the shortest term, 9 years. The renewal and renovation is 16. And then you can see soil's not very common. Housing and redevelopment, the two more common, are 26 years. As I noted earlier, TIF is a powerful tool. City and the EDA get to decide when appropriate, and you make your findings to capture all of those local taxes for 26 years. That's why it is a very prescribed process to get to be able to do that. The purpose for the use of the TIF revenue is to stimulate development where it would otherwise not happen in the reasonably foreseeable future. You're not trying to increase the returns for the developer. You're trying to make the project feasible. That means tax increment at a level sometimes that helps to get those cash-on-cash returns, debt service coverage, that the project is feasible for the developer and they can secure the financing that they need. Because more often than not, EDAs and cities do not provide the developers the monies up front. They need to finance the project and then rely on the tax increment to reimburse their costs in the future. You may be focused on creating jobs. That's true more often with economic development districts. Retaining existing tax base. Encouraging development of uses that would otherwise not occur. So it's not that something else may not get built on a parcel, but you're trying to encourage a use, an appropriate use of TIF. Enhancing the tax base. Sometimes it's about facilitating infrastructure improvements, and at the downtown site that we were talking about earlier, the one that the potential, that's an example. That's not just about that site. It's about helping to facilitate the infrastructure improvements and then coordinate new development with existing plans. The analysis of the request for TIF assistance, and that often happens through your staff and your consultants, is determining how much TIF is needed for a project. Just because you can go 26 years on a redevelopment district doesn't necessarily mean that the developer needs 26 years of tax increment. For example, when we look at a developer's pro forma and their returns, and I'm working on a hotel project right now, for example, and I have a developer trying to claim to the city that once they get to 20%, they still need TIF. That would be an example that we find it unreasonable to subsidize a project where the projected returns are approaching 20%, even for a hotel. Not that TIF isn't needed to get them to a point of stabilization, but not the full years. And I just mentioned that because it's not on autopilot that you can go 26 years on a district. It's like, why do you need to go 26 years to make the project feasible? Pay-as-you-go assistance, that simply means you're not providing any money up front. You're either requiring that the developer provide equity, commercial or a loan, mortgage to finance it, and that the developer is reimbursed semi-annually, and it's semi-annually because that's when taxes are paid for a project as the TIF is generated over time. And oftentimes a TIF revenue note is issued by a city or authority, and that is simply a promise to pay. It's no different than agreeing to that and language in a development agreement, but oftentimes developers want it evidenced by a TIF revenue note because they can mortgage or monetize that note to get upfront assistance on the private side. Upfront assistance. You can issue general obligation tax increment bonds, and specific to the redevelopment project in the city, that if and when that goes forward, that might be part of that for the infrastructure. That's still an option, it's just not as common. An interfund loan is when cities take money from one fund and borrow it to a TIF district instead of issuing bonds. And then, of course, any other source of revenue that the city or authority would have to provide assistance in advance of collecting the increment. Let's talk about development agreements. The function of the development agreement, and again, here I'm referring to a TIF agreement, is to lay out the terms for assistance. You're not, as part of TIF, simply saying to a developer or a private property owner that we're going to reimburse you your taxes for 26 years. That's not how the TIF law works. It's to reimburse specific costs, TIF eligible costs, that the authority actually has to report to the state auditor once a year on the use of those increments, and that's why the development agreement is so important. It creates the obligation and the promise to reimburse. It helps to manage risk for the authority and the city. And then it may serve as land sale agreement, construction agreement, business subsidy agreement, depending on if it is a commercial project. The business subsidy law may apply, and that simply means you have some additional steps and requirements that I'm not going to cover this evening. The administration of TIF agreements, City Council here provides authority and responsibility to the EDA to administer the agreement. So while the City Council ultimately approves the establishment of the TIF district after holding the public hearing, it would be the EDA that would enter into the agreement with the developer and administer the TIF district and make payments to a developer for assistance. And that can vary depending on how a city has set its structure up with an economic development authority. And really that agreement is so important because it really is how will the tax increment be used, what actions are required by the EDA and by the developer. You don't, even when that agreement is inked, it's not that you're promising. The developer has to perform, meaning they have to provide you with actual invoices, costs incurred up to the amount that you agree to reimburse with TIF, and among other steps. And if it's a housing project, there's even more requirements on the affordability aspects. There are ongoing obligations, especially with housing. Those income certifications for a portion of a market rate project, those are either annual or semi-annual, that they have to certify that they are in fact income qualifying tenants. Very important, because the state doesn't go to the developer if a district is not handled properly and say you need to reimburse funds. They go to an authority and say you did not have an eligible housing district. You need to pay back to the other taxing jurisdictions a certain amount. So very important part of that agreement. EDA agrees to use a specified amount of TIF. As I've stated a few times, it's not a reimbursement of taxes. You're agreeing to reimburse specific costs up to an agreed to amount. And TIF is available to the developer and or the EDA as defined in the agreement. Most of the time, EDAs keep a portion of the TIF at a minimum to pay for the administration of a TIF district. Sometimes it's more if an EDA or city is reimbursing itself for public improvements that the city or EDA is financing versus the developer. EDA requires the developer to certify actual project costs, as I noted earlier, and then the issuance of the TIF revenue note. The TIF revenue note is not a general obligation, full faith and credit pledge of the city. It is a pledge that is solely payable from tax increment from the district pursuant to the terms of the agreement. Most cities and authorities allow for assignment of agreements, and the reason for that and why a developer would seek it, that TIF revenue note is a promise to pay. It's a binding agreement with them. They can mortgage that or monetize that either with a third party, an investor, with their lender. Sometimes they seek to have the authority assign that agreement to the bank or to the third party and actually make those payments to a third party rather than the developer. Cities' authorities don't care so much who's getting the payment, but you care and retain the ability that they can't automatically assign that you have to agree to assign it. That's almost all agreements in Minnesota are written that way. Authorities and cities typically don't hold that assignment, but you retain the ability to know about it. As far as a housing district, it is not Section 8, and while we often call it an affordable TIF district, it can be a market rate project that has to have an affordable component under Minnesota law. It can be rental or owner occupied for a TIF housing district. With rental, it is either at a minimum an annual certification that the owner has income qualified the persons. It is not rent restricted. It is income restricted. And you might say, well, isn't that the same thing, Tammy? It can be, but you can have some senior housing projects where you may have seniors that have assets, or even other projects where a person may have assets, not income, but they still qualify as a person to meet those, requirements. For owner occupied, it is a one-time test, a time of sale. It has to be sold to an income qualified buyer, and once it is, that buyer can turn around and sell that house in a year to a person that is not income qualified. The EDA is, as I mentioned, the party that would be responsible for monitoring income limitations. And the reason the law is written that way is because the state doesn't want to be dealing and going after developers when there are TIF districts that were not properly handled. They hold the city or the authority accountable to that. Non-compliance impacts, and it's really the payback of the TIF. And as I noted, it's either annual or semi-annual. Business subsidy agreements, I'm going to go past this one quickly. Just note, if you're giving money to a non-housing project, most of the time it's going to be subject to another law, the business subsidy law, which simply means you have to hold a hearing, and oftentimes there's jobs or wages unless you notify for other reasons. I mentioned earlier I wanted to talk about managing TIF districts, and this seems kind of boring, but it's important. So there's a lot at stake with managing TIF districts for this reason. Again, there's a lot of power that the EDA and City Council has in capturing these taxes and being able to use them for express purposes. There's record keeping, there's compliance with a numerous number of rules. Sometimes there's requirement to return excess TIF. In the tax bill in May of this year, the state auditor and the legislature passed it, and the tax bill really tightened down on pooling. And I won't go into all the specifics because it's not specific to Maple Plain at this point, but just know that the ability to pool or spend increment from outside the boundaries of a TIF district has now been even further limited. Interfund loans and keeping track of that and reporting, and then decertification. Really touching back on the tax bill, the effect of those changes in law is going to require earlier decertification of districts once obligations are repaid, where in the past there was some ability to keep those districts open. And there is annual TIF reporting requirements, a very detailed reporting to the state auditor each year of every TIF district in the state. It matters because, again, you're collecting revenue from those other taxing jurisdictions, and there are a bunch of rules to follow, so record keeping really matters. I can't say how often I come into a city that maybe didn't do the best of record keeping, and you ask for copies of development agreements or where's your documentation of the payments that you made, and there's nothing. And it's not that people were willfully trying to not pay attention. It's staff turns over, people didn't know about it, and they just know you write a check every 6 months to this developer. That's why record keeping matters, so that when staff turns over, everyone knows what's going on. As I noted already, there was already a complex set of rules. Those got a little tighter in May of this year. Example, and I'm not going to read you these, but 4-year rule on a high level. State requires that you got 4 years for something to happen on the parcels in a TIF district. Otherwise, the county auditor, that term knocks them down. The district doesn't go away. But when a qualifying activity does occur, something development happens, it comes in at whatever the base value of that parcel is at that point in time. So you lose some of that increment. You really got 5 years once a district is established to either incur the cost, spend the dollars that are financed with other means, or to enter into those contracts. Because after 5 years, the state is very restrictive on the increment, and really practically the change in the tax bill this year, most cases would require those districts just to go away. And Sometimes that, in the past, that was a bigger deal with larger redevelopment, downtown redevelopment districts, because there was the ability to pool. Development occurred over a longer period of time. Previously, the law had some flexibility related to that. That's gone now with the tax bill. And I won't even get into, there's another rule, the 6-year rule that is on top of that 5-year rule. Point being here, not to memorize these rules, but to know that there are complex set of guidelines. I shouldn't say guidelines, rules for tax increment financing. TIF district fund balances. Not on point for Maple Plain, but for cities that have a lot of TIF districts with a bunch of balances when I'm before their EDAs, it just can't be, well, I saw that TIF district in our audit, it's got $500,000. Couldn't we use that for this other project over here? It's not that simple. In most cases, the answer is no to that. So really, here are some questions. I won't walk through them. When for cities and EDAs that do have balances, it's really understanding not just what the rules are, but potentially what the opportunities are and what the challenges are. Returning tax increment that is sitting in a tax increment fund isn't necessarily a bad thing for this reason. That's not a windfall to the county. The county receives those funds on behalf of the county, city, and school, and then sends proportionately those dollars back to each of those 3 taxing jurisdictions. And at that point, it goes into cities' general funds. So as you talk to your colleagues or hear other cities, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that the EDAs no longer have the ability to use those dollars. They become city dollars. And that's really what excess tax increment is. It's that where you have to return, and there is a complex set of annual reporting that happens with the state auditor, because the state auditor is charged of keeping track of all these TIF districts around the state. If you're really into this, the state auditor's office annually publishes a report on all the TIF districts and gives the legislature an overview. Pooling, this is less relevant since May, and this presentation was before May. Pooling simply means the ability to take increment from a defined area that you collected it and spend it somewhere else within a project area. That's still possible to some degree, but it really has to happen at the front end of the putting together the terms in the deal. Pooling, EDA administrative costs, the state considers those subject to pooling. So for example, with a redevelopment district, up to 25% of the increment can be pooled, and of that amount, 10% of the 25 can be spent on administrative costs. With large redevelopment districts, EDAs just do not have administrative costs to that level. It would typically be in the 1 to 2% range, but you may want to retain the increment for other eligible purposes at times. Counties also typically charge for administration, etc. Interfund TIF loan, you don't always have to issue general obligation bonds if you're trying to finance project costs up front and you're not doing a pay-go with a developer. You can borrow money from one fund to the TIF district, and then future increment is used to pay back that TIF district. That happens with some frequency across the state, because if you can avoid issuing bonds, that is often preferable. Decertification of a TIF district. That either happens automatically. If you reach the end of the duration, the county auditor ends it, meaning puts that tax base back to all of the taxing jurisdictions. Or you have sometimes the option, or now probably the obligation with the tax law change, to decertify a district early. In that case, it requires a resolution of the authority and some other process to do so. I mentioned the annual TIF reporting. So in summary, before I touch on tax abatement, TIF is really the primary tool in Minnesota for assisting development. But what you should take away from this is you can't just say, well, let's just TIF that. Let's just give some assistance and capture the taxes to assist that development. There's a bunch of boxes you got to check and process you got to go through, and you have to be able to qualify the project as a TIF district. Not every type of land use or project qualifies for a tax increment financing district. Simple in concept, but complex in application, probably as you've been sitting here listening to all these rules that I'm talking about. Property taxes created by the development are captured and used to finance activities needed to encourage the development. That's the whole purpose of it, is to make something possible that otherwise would not be. And then before creating a TIF district, the EDA must find that, in your opinion, that the subsidized development would not happen, and that term "but for" again. And that's very important, and it's a very serious responsibility as far as the decision to capture those taxes. I'm going to go on to tax abatement, and here, let's start by tax abatement. In this case is not truly, it's a misnomer, and it's how Minnesota law describes it. There is no abatement of taxes. It is similar to TIF in that a city, a county, and a school district independently, this is where it's different than TIF. So with TIF, the EDA mentioned your power that you can decide to capture the other taxing jurisdictions' taxes to assist a development that otherwise would not occur. With tax abatement, you oftentimes can get fairly close to, on a present value, to the TIF revenue stream, but each of the 3 taxing jurisdictions, the city, the county, and the school district, have to independently approve it, hold a public hearing, make their own findings, and agree to the term. If a project qualifies for TIF, that's easier for the developer because you get to make the decision. And the downside of it, it is much more administratively burdensome, meaning there's more reporting that is required and process. Tax abatement, it's a 10-day hearing notice. You hold a public hearing, you approve the abatement, and you can enter into an agreement with the developer. And it's not the EDA, it's the city council can make the decision to use its taxes to assist that development. And I'm speaking out of order of the slide, but just to continue this point, on tax abatement, a big difference with tax increment financing as well is that with TIF, once a building permit is pulled and if land is closed on, TIF is no longer an eligible use. Tax abatement, a city, county, or school district can consider approval of a tax abatement after a project has commenced. Now, the resolution would explain the findings as to why that is, but that is a very significant difference between the two. There's no statutory criteria findings for the public interest with tax abatement. It's public money. City, county, and school still, make the statements in the resolution as to why they're doing it. It's just the law is written different than TIF. It may use one or more multiple criteria, and everything the city or county school district does, of course, must be in the public interest, so a statement related. There's 8 areas of public interest listed in the statute, and where tax abatement and TIF greatly deviate is tax abatement can be used for public improvements when there is no private developer involved. In Minnesota, financing park improvements, recreation centers, ice arenas, the only means to do so in issuance of general obligation bonds without going to the voters is the issuance of general obligation tax abatement bonds. It's used quite frequently in Minnesota. I'm not going to go into detail about that tonight because I'm focused more on the private development side. But just if you hear about that or read about that a city's issuing abatement bonds and it's for a public project, you might say, well, how does that work? There's no taxes generated for that ice arena. The law allows a city and the other 2 taxing jurisdictions to capture parcels, their own taxes, to support those type of projects. So a decision to use tax abatement for a public improvement is really a decision to raise property taxes to support a project. So I just note that if you hear about that, a little bit different than what we're talking about tonight, but it's the exact same authority and statute. Certain projects may, as far as tax abatement and taxing jurisdictions, certain projects may be of sufficient importance that you want to go to the county and school district and ask them to participate. I would tell you from experience, developers do not go to a school district to say, I need assistance for this project. And more often than not, they don't go to the county either. So a tax abatement that involves multiple taxing jurisdictions, it is the city's EDA or the city that is carrying that water and helping the county and school district or making the ask of the county and school district just from a practical standpoint and who really does economic development in the communities. If one political subdivision declines to abate, You can go 20 years on a tax abatement. It is a very powerful tool as well, but unless there's private development and increase in taxable market value, if you're doing it for other purposes, it's really a decision to raise taxes to finance a project that you otherwise would not be able to do so. If all 3 taxing jurisdictions participate, the law limits it to 15 years of capturing those taxes to assist a project. There are limits, there's always limits. So state law, it's either 10% of the taxing jurisdiction's net tax capacity, and we talked earlier what net tax capacity meant, or 200,000, whichever is greater. For the larger cities, it's always number 1, 10% of net tax capacity. There's not a city in the state that's a larger city that's approaching their maximum just because it's so large. There are a lot of smaller cities that are at their limit of the 200,000. It's not a $200,000 project, it's a $200,000 limit on annual tax abatement that you can approve. So $200,000 a year can fund a fairly large project and to get the other taxing jurisdictions to participate. How it works is you have, different than TIF. With TIF, when you approve a TIF district, I mentioned before, and there were questions about the county auditor and assessor. The county has work to do with the TIF district. They actually reduce the city's tax base by what is captured within TIF districts and spread your levy over a reduced net tax capacity. With a tax abatement, the city has to levy the tax. You might say, I'm confused, Tammy. Why I mention this is because if you are doing a tax abatement for a private development project, keep in mind that you actually have to levy the amount that you are going to pay them. Does not impact your city tax rate, provided what you're levying is equivalent to that increase in the tax value, the tax base from that project. But sometimes coverage, newspapers focus on your percent change in your tax levy versus your tax rate. And so that's just, and you might still be confused. Just note with tax abatement, you as a council, not the EDA, the council has to approve that levy. That is different than tax increment financing. Similar, the calculation of the tax abatement levy, you identify parcels that you want to abate taxes on. Those parcels, the value times your tax rate really equals the annual tax abatement levy. And that is either, can be 10% of your net tax capacity or 200,000, whichever is greater in any given year. As I noted, why are we talking about this and when would you use it? You would potentially use it when you have a project, a private project, that would not qualify for TIF. It would qualify for tax abatement if the city made the findings as such. You may have a housing project without specific income requirements. Tax abatement is an option. There is no income requirement if using tax abatement to assist housing. And then an economic development project such as retail that would not qualify for an economic development TIF district. Similar to TIF, for a tax abatement, it can be on a pay-as-you-go. Developer, you pay your city taxes twice a year, and under terms of an agreement, we will write you a check. You can issue bonds, both when there's private use or public, and the interfund loan is an option as well. I noted these already, so I'm going to move past that. I'm getting to the end here. So summary for tax abatement overview. It is a useful tool when TIF doesn't work. That is when it is used most often in Minnesota. It is also a useful tool for public interest and public projects that otherwise would not qualify for financing without voter approval. I've stood before many a council where, you know, the council maybe was divided on should we take this to the voters for a referendum or approve a tax abatement for the issuance of bonds. That's really up to a city council and what a city council deems to be appropriate, because state law gives you that choice. And this is the one tool that allows you to finance certain projects that are otherwise not eligible for public financing. That was 52 slides I went through.
A little longer than 20 minutes.
Yeah, that is meant to be an overview. It is not specific to one of your projects. Each project is unique, and it was really to give the EDA a higher level overview. So hopefully that was helpful. happy to answer any questions that you might have, either for me now, or if they're later, if you let Mark know, I can follow up.
So questions for Tammy while she's here? Commissioner DeLuca.
Tammy, you know we had a project a few years ago that did not use tax increment financing. Why in the world would a developer not want to use TIF or ask for tax abatement? Why wouldn't they?
Oh, there are multiple reasons, but most often than not is because their project doesn't qualify. And doesn't qualify may mean that those uses that I talked about, or that their returns without tax increment financing are at a level that if they made the request to an authority or the city, the TIF could not be justified.
You mentioned that TIF can be used to improve infrastructure. Why would what infrastructure would a developer improve?
Sure. So if there are road improvements, access improvements, utilities, that a project is not feasible without those improvements, tax increment can be used to finance or to fund, if the developer pays for those improvements up front, to reimburse the developer. It can't be for any public improvement project in the city. Years ago in the 1990s, that was true with TIF districts. If you had excess increment and you had a road project in another area of the city, you could use that increment for that street road improvement. Today, those public improvements have to be to specifically benefit the project that is within the TIF district.
Other questions at this time? Well, thank you so much for being here, and we know how to find you, or Mark does, or staff. And we appreciate you taking the time, coming out tonight and being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy. Good presentation. And then having no other business before the EDA tonight, I'm looking for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Motion by DeLuca.
Second.
Second by Francis. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. All right, motion carries. The meeting is adjourned at 6:22.